Hello students, welcome to this lecture. Today's title of the paper is Plant Physiology. The code is BOC 104 and semester 4. The title of my lecture today is Transport of Ions Across Membrane, which comes under Unit 2, that is Mineral Nutrition. My name is Maria Beatriz D'Souza from St. Xavier's College, Department of Botany. Now, what's the outline of today's lecture? What we are going to see today is the various types of transport of ions across membranes in plants and the examples of this transport, that is the examples of passive transport and active transport. At the end of this, you will be able to explain the concept of various types of transport of ions across membranes in plants. You will be in a position to cite examples of active and passive transport and understand the relevance of active and passive transport in plants. Now, the movement of ions or molecules across a biological membrane may occur either actively or passively. And therefore, there are two types of transport across membrane, active and passive. Now, what is active and what is passive? As you can see here, the movement of molecules and ions from lower concentration to higher concentration, where energy is utilized, is active transport. Whereas passive transport is just the opposite. Here it is from higher concentration to lower concentration. And secondly, there is no expenditure of energy. So these are the 2 points that differentiate active and passive transport. Now, before we go in detail to that, let's learn a little bit about transmembrane proteins, or also called as transporters. Now, these are transmembrane proteins which are found in membranes. They act like vehicles, they act like automobiles, where they pick up the ions and molecules and transport these solutes to their destination. So they are basically transporters. They are basically like vehicles or automobiles. And you have 3 types: channels, carriers and pumps in this. Now here I have put a diagram for you where you can see that there is a channel protein and there are carrier proteins. Okay, so these are found in the cell membrane. So what do? As I told you, they are transporters. They help in transporting ions or molecules from one side of the membrane to the other. You can see here that the channel protein helps in passive transport, whereas carrier proteins help in active transport. Now, this is again, I'm repeating here, what is passive transport? Movement of material along a concentration gradient does not require energy, and this type of transport is dependent upon the permeability nature of cell membrane. One example here of passive transport is diffusion. Now, when the concentration of mineral salts is higher in the outer solution than in the cell sap of the root cells, the mineral salts are absorbed according to the concentration gradient by a simple process of diffusion. Next, we have facilitated diffusion. Now, here this takes place by transport proteins or transmembrane proteins. They function as either channels or as carriers. I've put a diagram here of facilitated diffusion. You can see the transport of molecules with the help of transporters. Now, again, I have described what are channel proteins here, the mechanism, how they function, and what are carrier proteins. Channel proteins aid in the facilitated diffusion of substances by forming a hydrophilic passage through plasma membrane through which polar and charged substances can pass. So they basically form pores, and through this they allow these ions or molecules to pass through. Whereas carrier proteins, they do not form pores. What happens here is the ions or the molecules, they bind to the surfaces of these carrier proteins. These proteins alter their shape. They reach these solutes to their destination and then go back to their shape and go back to pick up a fresh ion or molecule. Now there are various theories put forward of passive transport. One is diffusion theory, second is mass flow, third is ion exchange, and fourth is Donan equilibrium theory. According to the diffusion theory, if the concentration of the solutes inside the plant is lower than the soil, the mineral ions migrate into the root by simple diffusion. According to the mass flow theory, it is based on transpiration. Ions are absorbed by the root along with mass flow of water under the effect of transpiration. An increase in transpiration pool increases the uptake of ions by the roots. Next, we have the ion exchange theory, where the anions or cations present within the cells are exchanged for anions or cations of equivalent charge of the external solution in which the tissue is immersed. I have given you an example here. Now, there are two theories to explain this mechanism of ion exchange. One is the contact exchange and other one is the carbonic acid exchange. We next go to Donan equilibrium theory. This explains the passive accumulation of ions that are non-diffusible of fixed ions, which may be present on one side of the membrane. So, in this Donan equilibrium, in order to balance the charge of the fixed ions, more ions of the other charge would be required. Here I have given you an example of Donan equilibrium theory. What happens if there are certain fixed anions in the cell, and what happens if there are fixed cations inside the cell? In detail, I have explained here. You could take a look at this. Next, again, what is active transport? As I told you, where the movement of materials is against the concentration gradient and requires energy. Examples of active transport: uptake of minerals or ions into the root hair cells of the plant, and another one is the sodium potassium pump, which is found in the animal cells. Types of active transport: we have primary and we have secondary. Primary active transport moves ions across a membrane and creates a difference in charge across that membrane, which is directly dependent on ATP. Whereas secondary active transport is the movement of material that is due to electrochemical gradient. This is an example of secondary transport that is used to store high energy hydrogen ions in the mitochondria of plant cells and animal cells for the production of ATP. Now there are types of secondary active transport. Here we'll see two types. One is symport, where the molecules move in the same direction across the transport membrane, and other one is antiport, when the molecules are traveling in the opposite direction to each other. Here you can see it represented by a diagram. Symporter moving in the same direction, antiporter in the opposite direction. Next we go to theories of active transport. One is the carrier concept theory, where plasma membrane is impermeable to some ions. Thus, the absorption of these ions is facilitated by some special proteins on the plasma membrane called carrier proteins. These proteins combine with the ion to form the carrier ion complex, which can move across the plasma membrane. When the carrier ion complex reaches the inner surface of the membrane, they release the ions. After this, the carrier protein will go back to the outer surface to pick up fresh ions. So this is what the carrier concept theory says. Next we have the cytochrome pump theory, which is based on these following assumptions. The first one, it says that the mechanism of anion and cation absorption is different. Then second, anions are absorbed to cytochrome chain by an active process, and third, cations are absorbed passively. According to this theory, at the outer surface of the membrane, the cytochrome undergoes oxidation, loses one electron, and in exchange picks up an anion, which is then transported to the inner side of the membrane, and on the inner surface of the membrane, the anion is released. Here, the cytochrome gets reduced by the action of dehydrogenase involved in respiration. And finally, we have Bennett and Clark's protein lecithin theory, where he suggests that the carrier could be a protein associated with the phosphatide called as lecithin, and this lecithin functions as a carrier. Now, to sum up the lecture, here I have put up the summary that there are two systems of transporting ions and molecules. One is active and passive, second one is passive transport. In active, molecules move against the concentration gradient, they require energy, whereas in passive, it's just the opposite. Both these play a crucial role in supplying nutrients, oxygen, water, and other essential molecules to the cells. These are the references. You could make a note. Thank you very much.